welcome to Katrina's Creations Wednesday edition. And today's video is going to be about joining your knitting in the round. And this was requested by a viewer, and so I figured it was a good topic to talk about. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about just a real tiny brief history of knitting and techniques before we get started. The very first knitting needles were not the straight knitting needles that you would expect. Our very first knitting needles were double pointed needles. They were longer than the ones that we use today. And knitting was done in the round from the beginning. We later started knitting using straight needles and knitting flat. But knitting actually started out by using the double pointed needles and knitting in a circular motion. The circular needles that we have today, like this pair here, where there's a connecting cord and you don't need the double pointed needles, these were invented in the 1920s. So they're about 100 years old at this point. No pun intended. But anyway, I'm going to turn the camera around. And I have just cast on, that's all I've done, so I'm getting ready to join and I'm going to explain to you how I do it. All right, as you can see, I have just cast on stitches. I am getting ready to make a hat and it is not joined yet. This is my last stitch on my needle and this is my first stitch. Now, a lot of people would just begin at this end and start knitting back around, and when they got to this last stitch, that's when they would join. But the problem with that is where the stitches join, you get like a little notch that you have to go back and stitch closed later. So this technique that I use avoids that. You do not have to go back and fix that little beginning portion. So the first thing you want to do is just make sure your stitches are not twisted on the needle. And it's easy enough to see. You can tell that there's a little ridge along this edge. That's the bottom of your work. So I've got it all tipped in toward the center. Now I'm going to move my stitches on both needles up to the tips. There we go. I'm mainly concerned with the first and the last stitch. And this is going to be so simple. It's going to be a very short video, but I take my right needle and I pick up the first stitch and I slide it over to the right. And now I take my left needle and I'm going to pick up what's now the second stitch, but it was the last stitch. My neighbor's dog always decides to bark when I'm filming. So I've picked up this stitch and I'm now going to lift it over top of that other stitch. It can be a little fiddly, but it's worth it. So there you go. You can see, I'm going to move this up close. You can see I've basically crisscrossed the stitches. That kind of locks that circle into place. Then I'm just going to take my yarn and this stitch that I have now crisscrossed, I'm going to knit that stitch. And now I am going to begin just knitting in the round from there. It is completely joined at this point. And I know where my beginning stitch is because I can see where the tail is. When I come through the next time, I will just stick a stitch marker right here so I can mark the beginning of my round. But that is how I join. And like I said, it saves having a little notch cut out that you have to seam closed at the end. The interesting thing with circular knitting, you may say, what are the benefits? I never use straight needles at all anymore. I've gotten so I just knit back and forth using circular needles. And the reason is when you are using straight needles, the weight is carried on of the yarn, and if you're knitting a sweater, it can get heavy, and all of the weight is carried right on those needles, so it can be hard on your wrists. Where with a cable, whereas with a circular needle, you have a cord, and the weight gets distributed down into these portions. So even when I'm knitting back and forth, I tend to use a circular needle. And I just find that it's easier on my wrist. And another thing that's interesting with circular knitting is if you just do the knit stitch, it automatically becomes stockinette. If you were knitting it flat, you would have to do a row of knit stitch, a row of purl stitch, a row of knit stitch, a row of purl stitch. Whereas when you knit in the round, you just do the knit stitch and it automatically becomes the stockinette stitch. So it saves you time doing that as well. So I hope you have found this tutorial helpful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again on Saturday.